Dear speakers, dear Frederic and dear audience, I'm very happy to open this second session of our THD workshop, which will be devoted this week to the progress of rollout in Europe. Before the beginning of the session, I just want to share with you a few technical informations. If you follow this live through our website, France Stratégie website, please do not hesitate to ask your question to the panel via the platform. The session is also broadcast through France Stratégie YouTube channel, but notice that there is no possibility to ask questions through YouTube, so use website live. The replay of this session will be available at the beginning of next week. You can so share this information with all your networks. And please notice that we will finish recording the session at 1:45. But we will leave the session open if you need to have any interaction with the panel until 2 p.m. So I've been already too long. I leave the floor open for the debate, and please, Pierre-Jean and Frederic. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Anne. Just a few words, and thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to meet you again for this second session of the international seminar devoted to ultra-fast in Europe. As an introduction to this cycle, we have been able, during the previous roundtable last week, to draw up an initial report on the development of the policies implemented in the different countries and in Europe, and the correspondent regulatory framework. And in this respect, we have benefited both from experiences from countries such as Sweden, the UK and France, but also from the overall vision provided by the Commission and the BEREC. Today's session will allow us to go into more detail and understanding of the situation of ultra-fast broadband in the different countries. And we have already noted last week progress toward a gigabit society and the founding of a common European regulatory framework. Must, if not come up against, at the very last deal with a wide variety of situations, geographical, technical, and governance situations. It was therefore particularly important to be able to draw the state of play of fiber development in the Europe of 28 and the way in which each member state has organized itself to meet the objective of the European digital agenda. It also has been reminded in this very last day by Mrs. Verstager, the Commissioner Verstager, or the President of the Commission. It was therefore particularly important to be able to assess the state of play of fiber development in the Europe in terms of territorial coverage, to avoid the digital divide and allow every European citizen to access to quality online services, to define the different national plans for the articulation of public and private investments, the sharing or not of infrastructures, and the balance in the technical bundle between fiber, cable, or radio. In this respect, we will have the opportunity to supplement the example provided last week with spotlights on other countries of the 28, notably Germany and Portugal. I will not be much longer and therefore immediately hand over to Frédéric Marty, a member of the Scientific Committee of the Evaluation Mission, and who has kindly agreed to organize and lead this session. Frederic, it's up to you to.
Thanks, Pierre-Jean, and many thanks for giving me the opportunity to chair this session. So, in some few words, France Stratégie has to assess the French program to develop ultra-fast broadband, and in this framework, we wanted to make a comparison, an in-depth comparison between France and other EU member states. So we have organized last week, as Pierre-Jean previously said, a first seminar focused on public policy, on regulatory policy. And we will have, in the 2 next weeks, 2 other seminars devoted to cost considerations, to ex-post assessment, and to financing issues, mainly related to the compatibility, the compliance, of the different national programs with EU state heads regulation. But today, our purpose will be to make a comparison with other member states, Germany, Portugal, Sweden, in order to compare the progress in this deployment, in this infrastructure development, and to compare these various national experiences in terms of technologies, coverage, geographical coverage, with a special point on rural areas, that is to say low density territories, and to assess how private financing and public incentives or public policy are combined. So in this panel, we will have 3 different presentations. I want to thank our 4 contributors. The first one will be Niklas Forberg from the Düsseldorf Institute of Competition Economics. The second one will be Stefan Erning from the Nova School of Economics and Business, located in Portugal. And after these 2 presentations, we will have 2 additional presentations. The first one from Carl Jeding from Ericsson, which will be focused on the Swedish experience, and the second from Laurent Roger, or perhaps on the other hand, first Laurent and after Carl, some comments about the French experience. So I will leave the floor immediately to Niklas for his presentation. We will make, after the Niklas presentation, a first discussion, and after we will have the presentation of Stefan. We will make, in a second time, the presentation of Laurent Roger and of Carl Jeding with a common discussion of their two presentations. So perhaps just one word about Niklas' presentations. Niklas is a young economist from Düsseldorf, as I have said, and Niklas made in a couple of months ago a very striking and terrific working paper devoted to the development of ultra-fast networks in Germany, using German microdata and highlighting some very, very relevant point about some trade-offs between technologies, fibers and so on, and illustrating how it is important to make some, how to say, idiosyncratic development or policy in order to tackle the specificities of each situations, especially in rural areas, for instance. So I will leave the floor immediately to Niklas for his presentation. And again, Niklas, thanks for being here and accepting to participate to our discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much for the accolades in advance. Yeah, and I hope I can live up to that. And yeah, I just wanted to start with a brief overview over the current situation in Germany. So we have 40 million households, and in the gigabit area, 35% of those 40 million households can have gigabit connections right now, whereas only 10.5% are pure fiber connections. So we have this as a coverage. We have also extensive cable connections that provide up to 400 megabits, and this is relevant for 60% of all the households. And then we have a very extensive vectoring and G-fast coverage of around 40%. So, and for the talk, of course, I want to focus on where does the pure fiber, so fiber to the building and fiber to the home connections and deployment took place. And this was mainly done by competitors of the Deutsche Telekom and took place in very locally, very local areas and big cities like Cologne, Hamburg, Munich. And this makes up to 80% of all the fiber connections in Germany. And 20% is then very spread out, carried out by the Deutsche Telekom in other regions of Germany. So yeah, and beside this, so this is copper and this is fiber, there's also Vodafone now, which owns the German TV cable network, and we have a coverage historically of roughly 2/3 of all households that are also connected with TV cable. Yeah, so how did we get there basically? So 80% of the fiber deployment were carried out completely privately funded, which just translates into 9 billion overall in 2018. And the other 20%, of course, stem from subsidies and different subsidy schemes. And we have a very extensive subsidy scheme at the country level, but also on the federal level. And prior to 2018, we had a very different approach of subsidies, how money was given out in Germany. So prior to the 2025 broadband target, which is now envisioning gigabit speeds for all households in Germany, we had the target that just targeted 50 megabits per second for all households, and this was completely focused more or less on vectoring or other copper-based technologies, and also hybrid fiber coaxial architectures. And this inherently promoted the deployment or the focus of the incumbent Deutsche Telekom to invest basically in the existing legacy network, which is traditionally very, very good. So we have a near ubiquitous reach with the historical PSTN in Germany, and this subsidy scheme basically promoted this further use of the historical copper technology. So and this switched in after 2018, after the broadband target and with the new vision 2025, and now only FTTB and FTTH deployments are eligible to receive funding. So this was kind of a paradigm shift in the German subsidy approach, basically. Apart from subsidies, there's also a development of co-investments in Germany, but this gained speed only last year with a big joint venture of the Deutsche Telekom and EW ETEL, and they founded the Glasfaser Nordwest, which targets now to provide 1.5 million households access in Northwest Germany. So yeah, we are quite excited to see how this turns out and how this translates into yeah, fiber connections or the deployment of fiber in the future. Yeah, and apart from this, also the demand side is also gaining some speed recently, as take-up rates, especially for the fiber connections now, are on 43% mostly, and this is also an increasing development over the last years, and we think this could also accelerate the deployment of fiber. So, and apart from this institutional or policy intervention, so to speak, we as a researcher ask, okay, what are, apart from that, the main challenges and obstacles to overcome in promoting fiber access? And this is the question me and a colleague of mine at DICE were trying to answer in a recent research paper. And you already foreshadowed it. We analyzed micro-level data on 6,000 German municipalities, and we looked at network coverages of the period between 2013 and 2017. And there we looked for the drivers, or tried to identify the determinants of fiber deployment, basically, in Germany. And we find that the most crucial influences are structural and demographical characteristics of the municipalities, and it is very beneficial for instance, if the terrain is relatively flat. This refers obviously to the costs. The municipality is not that rural, and also if the population is quite young. So this is obviously a demand side indicator. Yeah, and all this increases the likelihood of fiber deployment. So basically the extensive margin. So how likely is it that a given municipality receives is accessed by fiber architectures? And the other dimension, apart from demographic and structural influences, were to look at technological competition, and especially there the focus on copper-based, the vectoring technology. And there we see only a small negative effect at the intensive margin. So this is given that a municipality is accessed with fiber, how much or which coverage percentage of households is achieved within that municipality. And here we see if over the time frame we observe, if vectoring technology or vectoring coverage is simultaneously increased by 10%, we see that the fiber coverage is reduced by 1.4 up to 2.4%. So we have here a negative effect at the intensive margin. We see that. So this could be a basis, basically, that indicates copper switch of rules are reasonable to introduce in some legislative framework, or to promote, to provide incentives to switch off old networks and promote new the deployment of new ones. So, and we also looked, okay, based on this finding, would it make sense to create a somewhat technologically non-neutral deployment environment, and ruling out the further use and the further deployment of vectoring structures. And here we used some geographical variation in the vectoring introduction in the German network landscape, but we do not find a significant effect here. But we say this is because we have, over the time frame, very, very little actual fiber deployment taking place. So this could be a power issue. However, measurement or intervention that is effective, we find is effective, is obviously deployment subsidies. And we examined this based on the very extensive subsidy program of the federal state of Bavaria, which alone funds the deployment projects in this area with 1.5 billion euros. So this is a very large subsidy scheme, and we find that 100,000 euro funding increase the likelihood that a municipality is increased by 3 up to 4 percentage points. And to put this in absolute terms, basically, if one would reduce the profitability gap, basically, successively by 100,000 euros, this would relate into 65 additional municipalities being accessed with fiber each step. So this is, if one just presents this way, is quite a nice and big number, so to say. And also in connection with this, we also find that it is very beneficial for a municipality if another one is very closely located that already has been assessed with fiber. So we see that there are some spillover effects that radiate basically from already accessed fiber municipalities, so which could be related to lower costs around. So and if one combines these two results, this would, in our understanding, promote or maybe one should think about scattering in a geographical sense subsidies more, and then make use of the inherent or national spillover effects to economize on deployment costs. So just as a kickstart for so subsidize one municipality as a kickstart, and then watch how commercial deployment takes over from this in a geographical sense. So yeah, and especially now with the other measures being in place, co-investments. So we have hope that Germany catches up in terms of fiber deployment, and I'm very keen how this plays out in the next years. Yeah, and I think I've said anything, and happy to take your questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Niklas. Perhaps just 2 questions to start our debates. The first one devoted to the relationship between, how to say, co-investment, mutualizations of assets, and competition. Have you some data or some insight from Germany making a relationship between co-investment among competitors and a given type of competition? That is to say, competition on services, on prices. Is there any effect in Germany? I do not know if you have investigated this point, but can we have some ideas, some insight for us? And a second question, could you specify how Germany has organized the regulation and the transition between these different technologies, as vectoring, cable, fibers, in terms of prices, in terms of deployment obligations, or in terms of commercial promotion of high-speed broadband?
Okay, microphone is still on. So on co-innovation, co-investments and competition, the relationship there. So prior to the joint venture, which was cleared basically, and was a huge issue also with respect to cartel objections basically. So cooperation was very, very local and very, very small scale basically, and were just driven by reducing costs. And I am not aware of any data-driven or empirical evidence that has already analyzed, okay, how will the competitive environment plays out in this locally co-invested areas. There was also the obligation that the co-investing parties, or the speak, have to provide access afterwards for third parties, which was the major concern basically. So okay, so the Deutsche Telekom said that we are willing to invest, but we want a regulatory exemption basically for the co-invested network, and this was not this went not through, and I think this is a very good decision by the Federal Cartel Office of Germany, and so access seems to be very important, that access is granted even if companies co-invest. So yeah. And regarding the second question, the transition between vectoring and fiber, or providing deployment incentives, I think outside the reformulation of the broadband target basically, and the eligibility of fiber or non-eligibility of copper-based structures, there hasn't been much of promotion to promote the transition. There has not much of consumer targeted promotion basically to influence consumer demand for more fiber-based services, and this is mostly, I would say, market driven, and also driven by commercial campaigns. So you have the very vocal Breco-Verband, so the Breco initiative in Germany, which is kind of lobbying for more fiber-based services, and also a company called Deutsche Glasfaser, which basically their business model is to provide fiber-based access to rural areas, but they make a marketing campaign in these small villages, and if they receive 40% of basically acceptance rate, or if they raise 40% of households demand, then they promise, okay, then we access your local municipality with fiber. So from a governmental perspective, other than providing some e-government services like I don't know, e-passport or whatever, there hasn't been much on promotion for transition between technologies.
Perhaps just one last question before the presentation of Stefan. Have you some data or studies to share about the relationship between the deployment of fiber and the impact on employment? Is there some studies in Germany addressing this issue?
There is a study by which looks at broadband levels, and also worker migration, which is by I can share it. It's a ZEW study and discussion paper, and also has been published in Telecommunications Policy, I think. And there is also a relationship with respect to deployment, but he looks also especially at the Bavarian deployment, and also subsidies, and looks at deployment, employment effects, and also worker migration within Bavaria and outside Bavaria. I can share you the details in just like 5 minutes, and I post it in the chat. So this could be the closest to your question. Yes.
Excellent. So again, thanks, Niklas. We will have now, if you agree, the presentation of Stefan Hörning. So Stefan has co-authored, I think, 3 years ago, a SER report with our colleague Marc Bourreau and Richard Fizet. And one of the advantages of the work undertaken by Stefan was to address the importance of demand-side policies. And we are very happy to have Stefan's presentation in order to speak about the role of incentives for leading customer to adopt fiber and to address the issue of technological choice, public incentives, policy, and so on. So, Stefan, thanks for accepting to participate to our seminar. And now the floor is yours for something like 10 or 15 minutes, but 15 is something like a maximum, a cap. So thanks, Stefan.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. Thanks for having me. As you rightly pointed out, this is a team effort. And let me just add that me, Mark, and another colleague, Maxwell, we also wrote a report for CERRE about co-investment. So just in case, since it has been mentioned, these reports are available on the CERRE site for free. So it's just go there and download them. The reason we wrote this report about ultra-fast broadband uptake was that a lot of work has been done in academics and in policy circles about coverage. But actually what counts in the end is that people take up the service. So if they don't have coverage, they cannot take it up. But once they have coverage, the question is, will they take it up and why? And why not? Maybe the more important question here. So what we first did in the report is to look at the numbers, and we looked at the various sources of data there are. And what we found is that, interestingly, there's a big difference between take-up of fast broadband, which we define as anything above 30 megabits per second, and ultra-fast, so 100 plus. There is a strong correlation between coverage and the take-up rate, so that is the ratio of uptake over coverage, right? So that tells you how much of what has been covered actually leads to take-up. In the case of fast broadband, the higher coverage is, the higher this take-up ratio is. With ultra-fast broadband, at least in the data that we had until 2017, there was no correlation whatsoever. So it seemed like completely random. So there were countries with very high coverage and very low relative uptake. Other countries with low coverage but very high relative uptake. So there seems to be different policies behind the rollout of ultra-fast broadband, or different incentives for take-up that are hard, of course, to find out about just from looking at these raw data. So one needs to study more in detail what exactly is going on. And maybe one hint is that the dispersion in the uptake rate is enormous. So just looking at the latest DESI report from the European Commission, you can see that the uptake, I have it here on my screen, the uptake for just broadband subscriptions in Europe varies between 58% and roughly 100% broadband. But if you look at fast broadband, it is between roughly 0 and just a bit above 60%. So the spread is enormous. I should mention Portugal. Portugal has an uptake that is, looking at this, that's almost 60%. It should be something like 55, 56%. So the second highest in Europe, which I'm of course happy about living in Portugal. If we look at the overall numbers for Europe, we see that fast broadband uptake, that is ultra-fast broadband uptake, at the moment is around 26%. The data from 2019, which is a third of total broadband uptake in Europe. So there's still a long way to go. In particular, also if we compare this to the targets. And one thing that we also underline in our report is that most of the targets that have been defined, they're coverage targets, not uptake targets. But there's one uptake target, which was 50% of households should take up ultra-fast broadband, that is 100 plus megas, until 2020. We are at 26%. So that there will be another 3 to 4 years at the present growth rates until we get to the 50% level. So that target seems highly missed. I think we should have uptake targets just to see where we are going and where we're not going. And so I think we should reformulate those targets, maybe be a bit more realistic, given that the previous target has been too high, clearly. Now, what we look in the report is what is the difference between incentives for broadband uptake in the early days and incentives for broadband uptake that will work once we get to ultra-fast broadband. And what we conclude in our report is that what has worked maybe 20 years ago in several countries will no longer work for ultra-fast broadband. The basic reason is that broadband coverage as such, it may be very slow, but broadband coverage as such is already very high in Europe. So what we need to convince people is to actually, once they have coverage, to switch to higher speeds. That usually has costs involved. This can be mental, psychological, just the uncertainty about what's going to happen, just having people come to your house, boring holes possibly. You may also have to pay more, or you have to pay an installation. And then there are the expected benefits, and they are also uncertain. So people compare those benefits and those costs, right? So the expected benefits, they should be higher than the costs for people to actually make a move. And behavioral economics tells us that the expected benefits is actually quite a bit higher than the expected costs. So that people get over this, threshold that makes them sit still. So what we considered in the report, we looked at many different cases, what has been done in different countries, the experience and so on. And what we found is that measures that may be helpful have to do principally with adoption cost reduction and creating certainty on the benefits side. And I want to go into those right now. Of course, I have to mention here that for broadband uptake, the lockdown and the present COVID crisis may be an important factor that could drive uptake in the future, simply because more people will work from home. More people will work from home with their kids next to them, or at least in the next room. So once you have, 3-4 people using video conferencing in the same house, you need a good connection. Slow broadband is no longer enough. So there will be pressure on just for the need of people to actually look for better connections. One issue is that in our study, we actually did a very raw classification of people into 4 groups. That is, people who can afford ultra-fast broadband and who want it, people who can afford it and don't want it, people who cannot afford ultra-fast broadband but want it, and people who can neither afford it nor want it. So I think the one issue that is important here is that those groups of the population who actually need ultra-fast broadband but cannot afford it, that they get targeted support. This is one recommendation in our report. And in COVID times and homeschooling in many places, this I think is important and should be available quickly to actually make an impact. Measures like, education for digital literacy is we believe, less effective nowadays because simply people are already used to using broadband, and Subsidies on computers and tablets may help, but again, it depends on the income groups, right? So we don't want to spend millions of euros to make people buy cheaper tablets if they would buy them anyway. So these kind of things, they need to be targeted to actually be useful. Another possibility that we found to be useful, which Niklas already mentioned, is collective purchase agreements. That is where people can subscribe to broadband offers as a group, and if enough people then sign up, then rollout actually happens, or they may get a special tariff. A lot of rollouts that was also shown has to do with word of mouth and experience. So fast broadband can be considered as an experience goods. And one important driver here may be just schools. So having schools connected and having the children experience fast broadband in school, and then they bring the knowledge home and then, well, nag their parents until they get a good connection. So that has been found to be an important factor. Okay, there are issues also on the legal side. So what we found is that there are some countries where a lot of houses are being rented. So it's the people actually live in these places. They quite often do not have the right to make the decision to buy fast broadband access if it involves, say, changes in the building works. And so there need to be rules that simplify that these places can have ultra-fast access, unless the landlord explicitly rules it out. But otherwise, it should not be necessary to wait for an okay by the landlord. That's one proposal we have. Another issue is that if it's costly to connect a specific property and this cost has to be borne by the client, then the possibility should there be for a long amortization period instead of just having it, limited to 1 year or so. So what we found on the lowering cost side is that targeted interventions, they should be best. But we should also avoid to just spend money on people and families that have enough funds to buy access and computers themselves. Concerning benefits, one issue, and I have the same issue in Lisbon, is that quite often you get very nice promises of high speeds, and then the outcome can be pretty dire. So I personally, supposedly have a 120 megabit per second connection, and quite often if I don't get disconnected, I get 3 to 4 megabits. So what is needed is guarantees that those qualities that are promised are actually functioning. There should be public information about the performance of the various operators, maybe in the various areas. So the one recommendation that we have in the paper is that there should be fine-grained information available about local broadband speeds. So also to see that people's expectations will not diverge too much from reality. If they do, then this also holds back rollout, right? Because people believe they will pay more, they will have hassle, and then the connection does not get better. So quality control and transparency here is really, really important. I mentioned high-speed access at schools already as a kind of knowledge spreading device. What we found is that digital service like e-government, for that you don't need usually ultra-fast broadband connections. So of course it's useful if you can, instead of going to government offices, you can deal with all kinds of paperwork from home, but 30 megabits there is perfectly enough. So these will not drive uptake. E-health has more potential in this sense, but still it's not used enough. It's not like, you know, we are using e-health 8 hours per day, every day per week. So there's a big difference to home office and homeschooling as a driver of demand here. We also propose there should be a clear timetable, public, for the decommissioning of copper networks, to make it clear to people that the copper network will be phased out, and so they move up from DSL to faster services like cable and fiber. And so the difference with these issues here is that really it's about generating expectations, but also keeping these expectations realistic and making the information transparent and available to people so they can actually verify and then see the benefits of upgrading. Other measures which were able to drive basic broadband uptake, well, we don't found them effective in the future. So what we foresee in the future for, say, further knowledge is necessary. So we would say we need more research, and this is for the empirical people here. We need more research into the drivers of ultra-fast adoption. There may be a difference between cities and rural. We should look into what the effect of the lockdown is. So maybe I hope some people are already collecting data busily. Commuting patterns change, working patterns change, and that will also drive uptake. And programs, if there are any done there, they should include from the start facilities to measure their effect, right? We need to get this knowledge, because otherwise it will be hard to actually judge what should be done in the future if we cannot compare programs. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for your presentation. You have addressed some very, very relevant point for us. The first one is the issue of cost. That is to say, the additional cost for households to make their convergence from slow down broadband to high speed or very high speed broadband. But you also address a very important issue, something like behavioral economics. How to persuade people to opt for fiber, to opt for ultra-fast broadband, when you consider the additional cost without a guarantee of quality in terms of speed of connection, and to make something like a trade-off among potential gains on one hand and possible difficulties in terms of shift from one supplier to another one, and so on. So it is an issue of under-assessing the advantages and over-assessing, in fact, the possible cost. But you mentioned that the COVID crisis played like a revelator by illustrating the risk to be locked down with 2 or 3 kids and 2 people in a house trying to connect in the same time to 5 video conference devices. So in fact, I think all these psychological difficulties can be not overcome, but a little bit identified by this kind of experience. But how to use for a regulator, how to use for a company, something like some nudges to provide these incentives. Is it just an issue of incentives? Is it an issue, you mentioned the point of transparency about the quality of service, or is it an issue, you also mentioned this dimension, of the quality of the offer of services?
Okay, yeah, so I've not been talking at all about the services that are offered over broadband, right? This is an important, I think this is the last thing you meant, right? So of course, we're speaking here over Zoom. There are other services like Teams and others, and these are used a lot nowadays. So there's a whole different world of services now that may be the killer application for having faster broadband that we were all looking for. As for the individual decision to make the switch, I think transparency is really important, and knowledge and certainty. So to eliminate the uncertainty of taking this step, because this is really what holds people back. You rather stay with what you know than something that's potentially better but that you don't know. So it's important that operators can guarantee a certain performance of their service, and this must be very clear. And maybe even people usually respond to something like warranties, right? Money back guarantees or whatever, or so that they feel they can have some kind of insurance against the risk of underperformance. There are many different things that one can imagine. Frederick, you're muted.
Yes, my mic was shut down. If we can have some question from the platform, do you not hesitate to ask question, to make comments?
Maybe just one small remark from my side. Regarding what Stefan just said, so the transparency and quality control aspect is highly important, because we also had this problem in Germany where providers were constantly underperforming, and available speed tests online were very, very regular, indicating that the speed is lower than advertised, basically. And this led to the fact that the German Bundesnetzagentur, the German NRA, basically provided an own speed test on their own website where subscribers directly could measure their connection. And if this just per one button click, this does not match my advertised contract requirements or characteristics, then you can directly file a complaint. And this reduced costs of subscribers and consumers to check whether their provider performs, and also provided a lot of security and reduced the characteristic of an experience good in the market. Yeah,
I think you made an important point here, which is the empowerment of the consumer, right? Instead of if things don't work, you have to dial up some support number, and then 1 hour later you get attended, and then never anything happens again. So if people feel that, and if it's real, of course, that they can intervene if things don't work, and this knowledge spreads, of course, because we're talking about the people who do not yet have fast broadband. That helps them to feel better about taking it up.
Excellent. So we can also address an issue in order to see to what extent the current COVID crisis might accelerate the adoption of fiber just because of this experience, and not just because of the availability of the offer. But perhaps we are a little bit late considering our schedules, and we can go immediately to the presentation of Laurent Roger about from the Agence nationale des territoires. Laurent, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Frederick, and thank you for inviting me. So just I have a few slides which I can show you.
Without to go through, yeah? Okay.
Okay, can you see the slide?
Yes, Laurent, it's okay.
Okay, very good. Okay, thank you. So the national plan in France is organized around 3 milestones. The first one is 2020, so it's the end of this year. And we aim to reach 100% broadband access, so more than 8 megabit per second. And of course, this is using different sets of technologies, both wired technologies and radio technologies. The next milestone is 2022, where we should be at 100% super-fast broadband access. And among this 100%, 80% will be fiber FTTH network. And we'll still have some about 20%, which will be either DSL or satellite or other radio technologies. And finally, we have a new milestone, which was set by the government about a year ago, which is now to bring FTTH everywhere in France. So this is fully aligned with the gigabit vision in Europe. And when we say FTTH everywhere in France, this means that 100% of households or companies that need to have access to FTTH will be able to have this access with limited cost or and limited delay. So this does not mean that, of course, 100% of premises will actually be connected to FTTH, but that we go deep enough everywhere to connect any place, any house where there is an actual need. And to reach these different milestones, the rollout is divided in 2 main areas. One which is in the more densely populated areas, which is led by private initiative without any public funding. So that is about 55% of the premises. And in more rural areas, deployment is operated by public initiative projects led by local authorities. And the government is bringing national funding to these projects. We have 3.3 billion euros, which are dedicated to funding with local authorities these projects in rural areas. And this funding is both a stimulus to the projects to make sure they go as far as possible, and they are also a way to ensure that the different projects are technically and economically coherent, since all the projects have to respect a set of specifications to get the funding. We have seen for a few years a very strong improvement in the economic and financial conditions of these public initiative projects, which means that recent projects are able to go much further in rural areas with less public money. So where do we stand today? FTTH deployment has really very strongly increased for the last few years. As you can see, we had a very strong 2019 year with 4.8 million lines which were rolled out during the year. And for 2020, of course, the conditions of deployment were impacted by COVID, but still there was a a very good mobilization of all private and public actors, and still the numbers for the first semester are still quite strong, even though the acceleration is not quite as strong as it was in the previous years. But still, as you can see, we should be at a level for the whole year similar to the previous year, which is above the targets we had to reach the national targets for 2022. So which means that in spite of the crisis, we are still very confident on our capacity to reach the 2022 milestone. So now, if we go a little bit deeper into each of the two areas, so this is a map of the private initiative rollouts at the level of the département. And so the color indicates the level of the coverage, so from 0 to 100%. And so, as you can see in these private initiative areas, the coverage is quite high, although there is still some way to go to reach the 100%, and there is still some heterogeneity between areas. But overall, the trend is clearly a strong increase in the availability of FTTH. In the public initiative rollout areas, as you can see, and this is logical, the rates of deployment are much lower because these are areas which are more difficult to go into, and here's the differences between one department and the other is even stronger than in private initiative areas. But still, as you can see, we have everywhere in France now a project that is started, that is having its first FTTH lines being deployed, and now our aim is really to have all projects going to 100% coverage, even in very rural areas. And so we are really working very closely with local authorities to make sure that all these projects are working correctly, and if there are any problems, to understand what is the situations, what are the difficulties, and how to solve them. And so that was about the deployment. We can see also that subscriptions are to superfast broadband is increasing. Currently, it's 12.6 million people, premises, sorry, who have access to superfast broadband. And as it was already said, we have some clear signals that the COVID crisis is pushing people to switch to FTTH, because many have experienced really some difficulties during the confinement period, and they have felt what it is to have insufficient internet connectivity. So we are also, so this was about the networks themselves. I just want to conclude to say that we are also very interested in the use that is made of the networks, because it's what will make the most of socio-economic value at the end. And we are especially working on making sure that as few people as possible are feeling excluded from digital services. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurent. I will leave the floor immediately to Carl Wedding, and after we can make the questions and the debate. So, Carl, the floor is yours. Carl Jeding is Director for Government Affairs and Industrial Affairs at Ericsson. And Carl will share with us the Swedish experience. So again, Carl, thanks for being here and to share the Swedish experience with us.
Thanks very much, Fredrik, and thank you for the opportunity to speak at this seminar. Ericsson is, of course, a global company with operations and staff in nearly all countries of the world, but we are for sure a Swedish company. I'm happy to share something of how broadband rollout is achieved in Sweden. I believe I had a couple of slides that I shared with you,
yes.
But first, I was trained as an historian, so please forgive me if I start with the invention of the telephone in the United States in the 1870s. But 10 years after that, Stockholm was the city in the world with the most telephones per inhabitant. And had we seen the slides, you would have seen a picture of the, oh, there it is. That's the central telephone tower in Stockholm in the 1880s. And Sweden has ever since then been very fast to adopt communications technology. And from a government perspective, it's placed a very high value on being well connected. I think part of this is due to having a domestic important telecom industry. And I think part of it is a symbolic value. It's important for Sweden to be seen as modern and innovative. But a large part of it is, of course, the real tangible benefits of connectivity. So I have colleagues of mine who've done quite economically robust studies indicating that on average, a 10% increase of mobile broadband adoption ratio causes a 0.8% increase in GDP. And also an increase of 10 percentage points in the growth of IoT connections per inhabitant is associated with a 0.23 percentage points increase in total factor of productivity growth. So the economic case for investment is sound. But then, of course, there are also strong social benefits of having universal access to high-speed broadband. I mean, we've covered many of these during our seminar today. I mean, as important social and societal functions are migrating to digital, and that process has speeded up immensely during the ongoing pandemic. To give you a personal example, right now, while I'm in this meeting, my wife, who is a psychologist, is in the other room treating patients over video link, and my daughter is conducting her university studies, and my son is taking his school classes all on video link, treating patient her studies, and my son at this moment. So I think you could argue that the social contract implies that all citizens are connected with sufficient capacity. You got the slide there of the government's broadband objectives. They're quite ambitious, simply saying that all of Sweden should have access to fast broadband by 2025. And what that means in practice is that 98% of all households and enterprises should have access to at least 1 gigabit per second. Of the remaining, almost all of them should have access to at least 100 megabits. And the very last 0.1% of all households and enterprises that are in the most remote areas of Sweden should have access to at least 30 megabits per second. And that, of course, comes with challenges. Could we take the next slide, please? Sweden is a large country with few inhabitants. The area of Sweden is slightly smaller than that of France, but still number 4 in Europe, I think, but with a total population of around 10 million people. And this map shows the population density of Europe. In practice, most of our population in Sweden is in 3 cities in the southern third of the country. The light yellow color that you see covering most of the rest of the country means fewer than 20 people per square kilometer. And even that, 0 to 20, is quite a broad range. So in fact, most of the Swedish territory has a population density on par of that with the Sahara, although covered in forest rather than desert. So could we go to the next slide, please? What we do have then is mobile coverage. This map shows 4G and 4G plus coverage of one of the Swedish mobile operators, Telia. And this very extensive coverage stems partly from the 3G rollout some 20 years ago, where the licensing of spectrum was conducted rather like an auction in coverage. The winning bidders offered to build out 99.98% population coverage with 3G then. And that extensive geographical coverage means that today there is an infrastructure to build on if you want to use mobile technologies for ensuring high-speed broadband, also to very sparsely populated areas. The Swedish model for investment support for broadband rollout is in general a pragmatic one. It sets out from the government's broadband objectives and is not so dogmatic on how to reach them. The chosen model is a top-down construction, which doesn't rely on demand pull from individual homeowners, which we discussed earlier. Instead, it gives investment support for network companies to extend the network from the nearest node in the existing network to a handover point from which the operator can then subsequently offer broadband connection of at least 1 gigabit per second for a reasonable connection fee. And in practice, this reasonable connection fee is interpreted as somewhere between 20 and 40,000 Swedish krona. It thus corresponds to homes passed rather than homes connected. This model is designed to be attractive for network companies since it's aimed at areas where build-out wouldn't happen on purely commercial terms. It also aims for creating competition where possible. It thus makes it possible for different types of network companies using different technologies to participate in the program in order to foster competition. Identified and named technologies which are eligible for investment support are fiber, VDSL over short distances, DOCSIS 3, and radio-based solutions. And what matters is that the chosen solution can deliver 1 gigabit per second. It needs to be said that presently, no such radio-based services have been built out with broadband investment support in Sweden today. However, the rollout of 5G has only started on a very limited scale. Spectrum auctions for mid-band frequencies in the 2.3 and 3.5 gigahertz bands will take place in November of this year. I think we can expect a large-scale rollout in the beginning of next year. And that will certainly enable radio-based technologies that can compete with fiber for providing high-speed broadband to homes and enterprises. One operator that offers that today is Verizon in the United States. And there it is, one of the early use cases for 5G in their network. It illustrates both the market potential and that it can deliver 1 gigabit per second. And just Friday last week, Telia announced that as of today, they start offering fixed wireless access over 4G. And once the 5G networks are upgraded, that will of course mean quite a different technical characteristic of that fixed wireless service. Finally, let me say a few words about financing. The government's ambitions are to some extent matched by ambitious financing. The Swedish government presented its budget bill this morning. And in the general context of economic recovery from the pandemic, it substantially jacks up the financing earmarked for broadband rollouts. So an additional 2.2 billion Swedish kronor is allocated for broadband rollout between 2021 and 25. For next year, the already allocated 200 million is increased to 1.6 billion there. So that's an 8-fold increase. And that is, of course, something we expect to have an impact on the speed and reach of the rollout program. With that, I'm happy to take part in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl. We have just 1 or 2 minutes before reaching a quarter before 2. So just one question, both for Laurent and Carl. Have you noticed any differences in private operators' behavior from the beginning of the rollout of the high-speed broadband and now in terms of cost, objectives, speed of deployment, or performance in terms of services? Have we realized some progress? Can we have some feedbacks about search and evolution?
Well, I don't know if I should start, but I don't have any really fresh data. But 2018, if I'm correct, some 81% of households and enterprises in Sweden had access to broadband of 100 megabit or faster. 77% of households had access to fiber, according to the Swedish regulator. So, I mean, all the low-hanging fruits are already picked, and the next step is, of course, to reach those areas that are really extremely remote. I think the openness of the Swedish program to include technologies other than fiber will be necessary for reaching people who live a long way away from the nearest village.
Excellent. Laurent, perhaps some insight from the French cases?
Yes, well, yeah, we have seen some progress on several dimensions. I think one key element was the interest from investors, which is much stronger now than it was a few years ago, and which enabled public authorities to launch more ambitious projects, and even private operators also. And also a second element is that we have really entered in a more industrial way to make the rollouts, and this is really what you can see in the progression in the numbers of the number of lines each year. It's the methods are more organized, costs are going down, and yes, this is clearly something where we have seen some regular progress year after year. So of course, now we are getting in more remote areas with specific difficulties. So there are new elements also to solve, but that's a continuous process, and that is being solved one step after another.
Excellent. So I have to thanks for your participation, and perhaps Pierre-Jean for some words before the end of this podcast. Pierre-Jean?
No, yes, I have to put back my microphone. Yeah, thank you very much for all of you. At the beginning of this series of roundtables, the idea was to substitute an in-depth research on the comparative analysis of the European situation, organizing rather some kind of discussion and juxtaposition of different presentation, and I think that the success of this presentation, of this roundtable, and the interest risen by your experience and different situations in countries is really a confirmation of our original idea was quite good, and I'm very waiting for the next meeting and going deep into this comparison. I think that at the end of the day, of the weeks or the months, the proceedings, at least the aggregation of the abstract of the presentation will be very useful in order to feed our mutual knowledge and our mutual understanding of what could be the best solution. So thank you very much, Frédéric. Thank you very much, Stephen, Nicolas, and Laurent, for your and Carl for your presentation. And maybe thank you as well, Anne for who is really la cheville ouvrière, as we say in good English, regarding the organization of this evaluation mission. Anne, you may conclude and say the final word.
Yeah, thank you, Pierre-Jean. Just very few words to thank you again the speakers and Frederick for having this debate. It's very important for us to have this panorama of a European situation for a program of evaluation. Just few words of the next session, which be at the same time, same place, and which be devoted to the funding, model funding questions. And the next session will be moderated by Fatima Barros, which is one of the members of our evaluation committee, and who help very much for the organization of all this workshop. So see you next week, and thank you very much.